the hidden deal with defeat. In the 1930s and 1940s, behind the smoke of war and the cries of the camps, a different pact was sealed. One inked not in blood, but in profits. The hidden deal with defeat. Let's dig deep. How American corporations empowered the Nazi machine. When the Nazi regime fell in 1945, the world celebrated the end of tyranny. Adolf Hitler was dead. The swastika was torn down. The Allied powers emerged as victors in a war that claimed over 70 million lives. But beneath the surface of this global victory was a quieter, more uncomfortable truth, one that history books often footnote and classrooms rarely discuss. While America led the charge to destroy Nazism on the battlefield, it quietly preserved, and in some cases empowered, key figures, industries, and ideologies from the very regime it had fought. Major American corporations maintained business with Nazi Germany, even as evidence of Hitler's aggression mounted. Some profited directly from the Nazi war machine. After the war, the U.S. government made strategic decisions to recruit and protect former Nazi scientists and intelligence officials, not out of sympathy, but in pursuit of technological superiority and Cold War leverage. This wasn't a conspiracy, it was policy, documented, deliberate, and buried under layers of bureaucracy and national security. This is the story of how America's pursuit of power, profit, and protection led it to work with, and sometimes shield, those who once stood under Hitler's banner. It's a story backed by declassified files, corporate records, and testimonies that reveal a far more complex truth than good versus evil. Let's break down the evidence. IBM, the data machine behind the Holocaust. Long before the trains rolled into Auschwitz, before a single gas chamber was built, there was a machine. Cold, mechanical, and unthinking. And it didn't come from Germany. It came from America. In 1911, a company called CTR was formed to build machines that could count people and process information. By 1924, it had a new name, IBM, led by a sharp, ambitious man named Thomas J. Watson. In 1928, IBM introduced a version of the punch card that would become a major medium to store, sort, and report data for nearly 4 decades, according to IBM's website. In the 1930s, IBM was a rapidly growing tech company known for its punch card tabulation machines. IBM's German subsidiary Dynamic, though headquartered in Berlin, it answered to New York, and to Watson himself, provided the Nazi regime with powerful data processing technology. This wasn't just office machinery, it became an essential part of Hitler's system for identifying, cataloging, and targeting Jews and other groups. Dynamic provided Hollerith punch card machines, a revolutionary way to track people by categories, religion, race, language, profession. With custom-coded cards, they helped build the data skeleton for what would soon become the Holocaust's logistical engine. Dynamic's machines were installed in concentration camps like Auschwitz, where they tracked prisoner movements and managed labor assignments. IBM's New York headquarters maintained oversight of Dynamic operations and continued profiting from its German subsidiary throughout the 1930s and into the early 1940s. Germany conducted national censuses in 1933 and again in 1939, with Dynamic machines humming silently in government offices across the country. But this was no ordinary census. These cards were designed to answer one deadly question: who is a Jew? Identifying German Jews wasn't easy. They were a tiny minority, less than 1% of the population, and were highly assimilated. Many had married Germans of other religions. All the information was all brought into one warehouse in Berlin, centralized. Day and night, these paper forms were punched into special IBM coding machines. The data included information on each citizen's mother tongue, their religion, their nationality, their profession, and their city of residence. Each entry in the database helped Nazi authorities identify, isolate, and persecute millions of Jews, Roma, disabled people, and other so-called undesirables. Once authorities had this data, They had all they needed to proceed with the persecution of Germany's Jewish population, through exclusion, confiscation, ghettoization, deportation, and ultimately extermination. And every IBM punch card had to be ordered from IBM. It was a proprietary system. Nothing worked without IBM's hand in the loop. IBM's contribution to Nazi Germany was so significant that Adolf Hitler personally honored Thomas J. Watson, the American CEO, with the Merit Cross of the German Eagle. As Hitler marched across Europe into Austria, into Czechoslovakia, into Poland, IBM followed. Die Hamig and its sister offices extended into newly conquered territories. In Warsaw, a new front opened, Watson Business Machines, IBM's Polish branch. Its job? To help the Nazis count, categorize, and control the people of Poland. Even in France, under the Vichy regime, IBM's French subsidiary provided the data tools to track Jews for deportation. IBM's empire grew, not by weapons, but by calculation. By now, World War II had begun. Officially, IBM was based in America. The US was still neutral. But behind closed doors, IBM routed all Nazi contracts through its office in neutral Switzerland, Geneva. From there, IBM oversaw contracts, repairs, deliveries, and machine installations, even for governments at war. When trains rolled into concentration camps, it wasn't just German steel carrying souls. It was IBM logistics, calculated in Geneva, coded in Berlin, and serviced across Europe. By 1941, death had become data. IBM punch cards were used to manage nearly every aspect of the final solution. Deportation schedules, labor assignments, prisoner trackings, and camp capacity. Special codes were printed on punch cards. 6 meant for Jew, 12 meant for Gypsy, 9 meant to be executed. These were not accidental entries. These were deliberately designed codes, printed with IBM's approval on IBM's paper for IBM's machines. IBM machines could not operate on regular paper. They needed IBM-manufactured punch cards, millions of them, printed with precision. Between 1939 and 1945, IBM delivered an estimated 1.5 billion punch cards, many routed via Switzerland. Each was single-use. Each was custom-coded. Each one helped define the fate of someone somewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe. When the war ended, the machines were still there. Tabulators were recovered from concentration camps, still labeled with IBM serial numbers. Yet IBM denied knowledge, denied accountability, and protected its archives. No reparations, no remorse, no public apology. Instead, the company moved forward into computing, into space, into the future. In 2001, Edwin Black published his book, IBM and the Holocaust. It exploded like a bomb in the world of history and business. The pages didn't just expose machines and memos, they exposed moral collapse at the highest levels. Edwin Black argues in his book that Watson sold IBM punch cards to Nazi Germany knowing what atrocities the technology would lead to. Black wrote that by the start of World War II in 1939, IBM was supplying Nazi Germany with more than 1 billion punch cards a year. Black wrote that the punch cards were used to identify Jewish people to be targeted for asset confiscation, ghettoization, deportation, and ultimately extermination. Such a task would require searching through generations of communal, church, and governmental records across Germany. Black argues that a census of this scale would not be possible without IBM's punch card technology. Punch cards also allocated food and allowed Nazis to starve Jewish people, managed slave labor in concentration camps, and ensured that the trains run on time. His findings were undeniable. Machines were tracked, repairs were logged, profits were counted. And the world finally saw what it had missed: genocide by bureaucracy, mass murder by tabulation. IBM never sued him, never publicly denied the facts, but behind closed doors their lawyers circled. The Jeep, as faithful as a dog, as strong as a mule. In 1940, the Nazi army asked car companies to come up with a design for a lightweight, four-wheel drive vehicle that could be mass-produced and essentially take the place of what horses had been in warfare for centuries. The vehicle had to conquer all kinds of terrain, and it had to be able to carry a 625-pound load. 3 companies built prototypes: Willis Overland, Ford, and Bantam. The first 2 went on to make some 660,000 Blitz buggies. Willis built 376,379 and Ford 282,352. Because the vehicles by both had to use interchangeable parts, they were very similar. Miraculously, the first Jeep that Ford constructed, GP number 1 Pygmy, still exists. It's on display at the U.S. Veterans Memorial Museum in Huntsville, Alabama. Henry Ford was not just a car magnate. He was also a vocal anti-Semite. His book, The International Jew, was translated into multiple languages and admired by Adolf Hitler himself. Ford was even awarded the Grand Cross of the German Eagle by the Nazi government in 1938, the highest honor a foreigner could receive. Ford's German plant, Fordwerke, was partially owned by the Detroit headquarters and manufactured thousands of vehicles for the Wehrmacht. According to records, Fordwerke produced at least 78,000 trucks for the Nazis during the war. Even after the U.S. entered the war in 1941, there was evidence that the company continued to benefit indirectly through Swiss intermediaries. During World War II, Fordwerke used forced labor, men, women, and children taken from occupied countries. Many were prisoners. Some were concentration camp inmates. They worked in brutal conditions, unpaid, underfed, and afraid. Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he made it available to the masses. With the Model T and the assembly line, Ford turned American innovation into an empire. More than 15 million Model Ts were manufactured in all, reaching a rate of 9,000 to 10,000 cars a day in 1925, or 2 million annually. But behind the scenes, Ford harbored views that would soon align with the darkest ideologies of the 20th century. The Model T, however, was no technical gem, but its simplicity made it ideal for continual improvements in production efficiency. The similarities between the Model T and the B-24 bomber, one of Ford's best-known contributions to the United States World War II effort, are notable. And what started as transportation for the people would become a machine for tyranny. Long before Hitler rose to power, Henry Ford was already promoting anti-Semitic conspiracy theories through his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent. Within its pages, he published The International Jew, a toxic publication filled with the kind of rhetoric that would soon be echoed in Nazi Germany. Adolf Hitler greatly admired Ford. In Mein Kampf, he referred to Ford as a great man and even displayed his portrait in his Munich office. The roots of collaboration were already taking hold, both ideologically and industrially. In 1933, as Hitler rose to power, the Third Reich set out to build a self-sufficient German economy, and automobiles were at the center of that vision. Fordwerke, the German branch of the Ford Motor Company, quickly became a cornerstone of Nazi Germany's automotive expansion. At its factory in Cologne, Ford began producing trucks and vehicles essential to the Reich's growing infrastructure, including military transport. Remarkably, even as Germany moved closer to war, Ford maintained full ownership and control from its headquarters in Detroit. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, most American companies pulled back, but Ford didn't. Instead, Fordwerke ramped up production, supplying military vehicles, trucks, and engine parts to the Nazi war effort. Company records reveal that communication between Ford's American headquarters and its German subsidiary continued, even as the world descended into war. One internal report noted that German officers praised Ford for being more efficient than their own military factories. Beneath the factory floors of Fordwerke, there was no freedom, only forced labor. The company depended on prisoners of war and civilians from occupied nations, many of whom were forced to work at gunpoint. Under brutal conditions and constant surveillance, They assembled trucks for Nazi armies advancing across Europe. As the Wehrmacht swept through Europe, they moved on wheels made by Ford Werke. The Cologne plant supplied them with everything they needed: heavy-duty trucks for transporting troops, engines to power tanks, vehicles deployed on the Eastern Front and in North Africa. Ford's German factory became the backbone of Nazi military logistics. And while the American press remained largely silent, internal memos reveal that Ford executives knew exactly where their trucks were headed and what they were being used for. Back in Detroit, company leadership walked a careful line. They claimed to have lost control of their German operations during the war. But corporate filings and telegrams tell a different story. Profits continued. Dividends were paid. There was no real attempt to shut down production. In fact, as late as 1942, Ford even requested special permission from the U.S. government to maintain business ties in Axis-controlled territory. When the war ended, the factories still stood. But so did the questions. How could an American company help build the transport fleet of the Third Reich? How could it allow forced labor inside its own facilities? And how, after all that, could it demand compensation? Yes, in a stunning twist, Ford Motor Company filed for damages with the U.S. government. They sought and received reimbursement for destruction caused by Allied bombing raids on their German factories. They were paid for losing factories they had used to fuel fascism. They weren't just building cars. They were building the infrastructure of war, the logistics of genocide, the silent engine of oppression. To the Third Reich, Ford wasn't a foreign company. It was a trusted partner. The world remembers Ford as the company that revolutionized industry. But it must also remember this: for a time, Ford helped drive the Reich toward ruin. This is history, recorded in government archives, corporate memos, and the voices of those who labored under a foreign sky, assembling engines for their own destruction. Yes, Ford helped pave the roads of America, but in Nazi Germany they helped build the wheels of war. And in 1945, after the war had ended, Ford Motor Company quietly applied for compensation from the U.S. government for bomb damage to its German plant. Yes, while survivors searched for their families, Ford searched for refunds. General Motors, building Hitler's arsenal. Through its German subsidiary Opel, General Motors played a critical role in Hitler's rearmament campaign. By 1929, GM had fully acquired Opel, and by the late 1930s, it had become the largest automobile manufacturer in Germany. When war erupted, Opel shifted its focus to military production, building Blitz trucks, aircraft engines, and even components used in tanks. GM executives were aware of these wartime operations. In fact, they reportedly went so far as to suppress the development of fuel-efficient engines in the United States, allegedly to avoid competing with their German arm. At the start of the 20th century, General Motors wasn't just an American success story. It was a symbol of modern industrial power. With iconic brands like Chevrolet, Buick, and Cadillac, GM rose to become a global force, crossing borders, shaping economies, and moving nations. But its ambitions didn't stop at America's edge. This wasn't just business. It became something far more consequential. It became a lifeline for the Third Reich. The most iconic product to emerge from GM's German operations was the Opel Blitz, a fast, durable, and highly reliable truck. The Nazis used it for everything: transporting troops, towing artillery, and delivering supplies deep into the Eastern Front. These trucks became the backbone of the Wehrmacht's mobility. In many ways, the Blitz was to Hitler what the Jeep would later become to the Allies, the muscle behind the movement. And while Allied forces struggled to disrupt German supply lines, thousands of Blitz trucks, built in GM-owned Opel factories. As Germany prepared for war, General Motors saw its profits soar. By 1938, reports show that GM's Opel division had become its most profitable foreign subsidiary. In return, Hitler's government offered generous incentives, protection, tax breaks, and even official honors for GM's foreign leadership. Despite clear signs of looming aggression, Austria annexed, Czechoslovakia dismantled, Jews openly persecuted, GM didn't back away. From its Opel plants in Brandenburg and Rüsselsheim, GM produced tanks, bomb components, aircraft engines, and armored trucks. The Third Reich depended on a steady supply chain, and GM didn't just maintain it, they expanded it. Even after the United States entered the war in 1941, GM continued to profit through Swiss intermediaries and a web of shell companies. By the early 1940s, Germany's labor force was stretched thin, so they turned to the enslaved. At GM's Opel factories, forced labor became standard. When the Reich finally collapsed, Opel lay in ruins, but General Motors didn't walk away empty-handed. In a move as cold as steel, GM filed a claim with the US government, seeking compensation for damage to its German factories caused by Allied bombing. And they won. GM was awarded millions of dollars for property that had powered Hitler's war machine. There was no investigation. For decades, General Motors kept its wartime record buried beneath layers of corporate red tape. Official statements insisted the company had lost control of its German subsidiary during the war. But internal memos, declassified intelligence reports, and survivor testimonies tell a very different story, one of profit placed above principle. Even today, GM's official histories make little to no mention of Opel's role in the Nazi war effort. During World War II, General Motors was hailed as the arsenal of democracy, celebrated for building planes and tanks for the US military. But at the same time, its factories in Nazi Germany were arming the enemy. Standard Oil fueling the Nazi war machine. Standard Oil of New Jersey, the company that would later become ExxonMobil, was deeply intertwined with Nazi Germany's wartime fuel supply. One of the most vital resources during the war was tetraethyl lead, a chemical additive that made high-performance aviation fuel possible. Standard Oil held the patent, and through direct and indirect channels, they provided it to Nazi Germany. The company feared that if they refused to cooperate, Germany would turn to alternative sources, shutting the United States out of post-war markets. So they continued to deal, even as Jews were rounded up, cities reduced to rubble, and entire nations engulfed in flames. Oil, the lifeblood of modern war. It powered tanks, fueled bombers, lubricated engines, and carried chemicals across continents. In the late 1920s, Standard Oil entered into a series of licensing and production agreements with IG Farben, Germany's chemical powerhouse, and the same company that would later manufacture Zyklon B, the poison used in Nazi gas chambers. The deal was straightforward. Standard Oil would supply the critical patents and chemical processes needed to produce synthetic fuel, a resource Nazi Germany desperately lacked. In exchange, Standard Oil received millions in licensing fees, stock shares, and worldwide distribution rights. Together, the two corporations cracked the formula for tetraethyl lead, a key compound in producing high-octane aviation fuel. It was vital for the Luftwaffe, Hitler's air force, giving German aircraft the speed and performance needed for blitzkrieg warfare. As war loomed over Europe, the United States government imposed strict bans on the export of strategic materials to Germany. But Standard Oil found a way around it. Through a network of Swiss intermediaries, offshore subsidiaries, and complex licensing agreements, the company continued supplying the Reich, disguised beneath a cloak of legal technicalities. Documents reveal how shipments were routed through neutral countries like Switzerland and Spain, ensuring Germany maintained uninterrupted access to the chemical technologies it needed to sustain its war machine. By the time German bombers filled the skies over London and Warsaw, many of them were flying on aviation fuel made possible by Standard Oil technology. Nazi Germany had no significant oil reserves, but thanks to American chemical expertise, they were able to manufacture what they couldn't drill. Without Standard Oil's contributions, the Luftwaffe may have never gotten off the ground. Even after the United States entered the war in 1941, Standard Oil's ties to Nazi Germany remained disturbingly intact. American and British intelligence intercepted internal communications revealing that Standard subsidiaries in South America continued to ship oil, lubricants, and key supplies to Axis-aligned buyers. From Venezuela to Argentina to Brazil, Standard oil tankers were still moving product, fuel that ultimately found its way to Nazi-controlled ports. In 1942, President Roosevelt's administration launched a covert investigation into Standard Oil's wartime activities. What they uncovered was deeply troubling. The inquiry confirmed that Standard Oil had withheld critical patents from the U.S. military, while allowing Nazi Germany unrestricted access to the same technology. Even more disturbing, the company had actively tried to block synthetic rubber production in the United States, fearing it would undercut its joint profits with Germany's IG Farben. The U.S. government forced the company to surrender the patents and pay a fine of just over $50,000, a symbolic penalty for a corporation that had earned millions during the war. Standard Oil's German partner, IG Farben, one of the largest chemical conglomerates in the world at the time, built a sprawling synthetic fuel and rubber plant just 3 miles from Auschwitz. At that site, thousands of Jewish prisoners were forced to labor and die, producing synthetic fuel and rubber for the Nazi war machine. In 1945, a report from the U.S. Justice Department confirmed that Standard Oil had entered into cartel agreements with IG Farben, granting Nazi Germany access to American fuel technology at a critical moment in history. After the war, IG Farben executives stood trial at Nuremberg. Some were imprisoned. Others were quietly reabsorbed into post-war German industry. Standard Oil, however, faced no such reckoning. Its role in fueling Hitler's war machine disappeared behind layers of rebranding and corporate evolution. It became Exxon, and its wartime legacy faded into the fog of economic progress. The company denied wrongdoing. Standard Oil, once a symbol of American industry, became the quiet supplier of terror. Coca-Cola, the birth of Fanta in Nazi Germany. This isn't just a story about weapons or war machines. It's a story about branding, survival, and a company that found a way to keep doing business under Hitler and even thrive. By the 1930s, Coca-Cola was more than a beverage, it was an American icon. With its unmistakable glass bottle and bold red and white branding, Coke had spread across continents, embedding itself into the global marketplace. Coca-Cola GmbH even sponsored Hitler Youth events, participated in Aryanized trade fairs, and curated its messaging to fit the mood of the new Germany. The company wasn't loyal to ideology, it was loyal to the market. In 1936, when Nazi Germany hosted the Berlin Olympics, Coca-Cola stood proudly as an official sponsor. Coca-Cola banners flew high in Olympic stadiums. It was a marketing triumph and a moral blind spot. In 1933, under the leadership of a sharp and ambitious executive named Max Keith, Coca-Cola's German branch, Coca-Cola GmbH, began to thrive. In 1941, after Germany declared war on the United States, Coca-Cola's headquarters in Atlanta was legally barred from shipping syrup to its German bottlers. The flow of ingredients stopped, but Coca-Cola GmbH didn't. With no Coca-Cola syrup and no contact with the U.S. parent company, Max Keith refused to shut down operations. Instead, he created something new, a drink that would eventually become one of the most famous soft drinks in the world. As American exports to Germany were cut off, Coca-Cola's German division faced a turning point. Unable to import the syrup required to make Coke, Keith and his team developed a substitute, using locally available ingredients like apple fiber and whey. The result was Fanta, invented in 1941 as a wartime workaround to keep the business alive under Nazi rule. But Fanta wasn't just a makeshift product. It was a calculated business strategy, a way to keep Coca-Cola's factories running, to maintain market control, to protect its infrastructure and profits, even under the shadow of the Third Reich. It was silence packaged in a bottle, a brand preserved, while a nation spiraled into darkness. By 1943, Germans were drinking more than 3 million cases of Fanta a year, a drink born from wartime scarcity, but branded with joy. Coca-Cola didn't disappear during the war. It simply reinvented itself. It traded red for orange, Coke for Fanta. But beneath the new label, it was still the same corporation, guided by the same priorities. When the war ended, Max Keith wasn't condemned by Coca-Cola's American leadership. He was celebrated, praised for protecting the brand, preserving the infrastructure, and even growing revenues under impossible conditions. There was no internal investigation, no corporate review of Coca-Cola GmbH's wartime conduct. Instead, the U.S. headquarters resumed control. Fanta was reformulated, rebranded, and eventually relaunched as a cheerful, family-friendly drink, its origins quietly erased. Coca-Cola's path through Nazi Germany is not just a story of business. It's a story of adaptation, silence, and survival. DuPont, the chemical collaborator. In the early 90s, no company represented industrial America more than DuPont. What began as a gunpowder manufacturer grew into a global powerhouse, producing everything from explosives and synthetic fibers to plastics and fuel additives. DuPont didn't just support the war economy, it helped shape it. Its reach extended from the trenches of World War I to the forefront of American innovation and manufacturing. But beneath its image of progress and patriotism, the company was quietly building international relationships, one of which would tie its chemical breakthroughs to Hitler's rise and the machinery of Nazi conquest. During the 1920s and 1930s, DuPont entered into a powerful partnership with Germany's IG Farben, the largest chemical company in Europe at the time. Together, they exchanged patents, shared research, and developed new production methods, especially in the fields of synthetic fuel and industrial chemicals. Corporations like DuPont, IG Farben, Digesh, and Tesch and Stabenow received purchase orders, processed invoices, scheduled deliveries. And they complied quietly, methodically, shielded by legal contracts, business language, and the cold logic of commerce. The system was engineered to kill efficiently. They didn't need to believe in Nazi ideology. They only needed to believe in their profits. DuPont was one of roughly 150 American companies that provided Nazi Germany with patents, technology, and materials that played a critical role in the German war machine. Among the most significant outcomes of DuPont's collaboration with IG Farben was the development of tetraethyl lead, a gasoline additive that enabled the production of high-octane aviation fuel. Together with Standard Oil and General Motors, DuPont co-owned the Ethyl Corporation, the company that controlled the global production and licensing of this vital compound. The stakes were enormous. While the Allies needed it to fuel long-range bombers across the Atlantic, the Luftwaffe needed it to dominate the skies over Europe. Thanks to pre-war licensing agreements, IG Farben had full access to the chemical formula and the industrial capacity to manufacture it. Even after the war began, the patents remained intact, protected not by diplomacy, but by corporate lawyers and legal frameworks that treated chemistry as business, not as a matter of conscience. Although DuPont had no official partnership with IG Farben, the ties were unmistakable, linked through shared patents, international chemical cartels, and its close relationship with Standard Oil, which openly collaborated with IG Farben in the years leading up to World War II. In 1940, as Hitler's forces swept across Europe, American intelligence began to sound the alarm. They discovered that DuPont and its corporate partners were intentionally withholding critical chemical patents from U.S. military laboratories, fearing that large-scale wartime production could threaten their post-war market dominance. While American planners scrambled for alternatives, Germany faced no such barriers. DuPont wasn't just producing chemicals, it was pioneering materials that would shape the future of warfare. Meanwhile, in Germany, IG Farben, armed with DuPont's patents, built enormous synthetic rubber facilities, including one at Monowitz, just a few miles from Auschwitz. These were not ordinary factories. They were fueled by slave labor. Tens of thousands of concentration camp prisoners were forced to work in brutal, inhuman conditions, producing the very materials used to equip Hitler's war machine. After the war, IG Farben executives stood trial at Nuremberg for their crimes. But DuPont? Not a single executive was called to testify. Not one corporate partnership was scrutinized. DuPont resumed business as usual. Its public image remained untouched. The company would go on to invent Teflon, Kevlar, and space-age polymers, while its role in wartime collaboration quietly slipped into the shadows of history. There was no apology, no public acknowledgement of its indirect ties to IG Farben. While Holocaust survivors remembered the rubber, the fuel, the factories, DuPont remained a pillar of American industry. To this day, many records remain sealed, and the ethical reckoning remains buried beneath layers of scientific progress and patriotic branding. DuPont's story in World War II isn't one of bullets or bombs. It's a story of blueprints, licensing agreements, and strategic silence. Pratt & Whitney and Curtiss-Wright. America's aviation industry rose from factory floors to global prominence. Two names towered above the rest: Pratt & Whitney, the powerhouse behind America's most advanced aircraft engines, and Curtiss-Wright, the trailblazing aviation firm born from the merger of Glenn Curtiss's legacy and the Wright brothers' historic vision. These companies supplied the engines that powered America's fighter planes, bombers, and commercial aircraft. But behind the patriotic headlines lies a more complicated story, one marked by unintended complicity, overlooked licensing, and technologies that slipped into Nazi hands. Throughout the 1930s, as Adolf Hitler quietly rearmed Germany in open defiance of the Treaty of Versailles, American aviation technology made its way into the Third Reich, not through espionage, but through business. German firms like BMW and Daimler-Benz secured licensing agreements with Pratt & Whitney and Curtiss-Wright, gaining access to supercharged radial engine designs, high-performance aircraft components, advanced cooling systems, and metallurgy techniques essential for high-altitude flight. These deals were legal at the time, but they were dangerously short-sighted, morally blind to the storm that was gathering in Europe. As the Luftwaffe thundered into battle over Europe, its Junkers bombers, Messerschmitt fighters, and Focke-Wulf aircraft often carried the imprint of American engineering. The outcome? A German Air Force that, in the early years of World War II, had the speed, altitude, and reliability to dominate the skies. After the war, Pratt & Whitney and Curtiss-Wright maintained that they had no control over how their patents were used once licensed overseas. But internal documents from the late 1930s tell a different story. Correspondence reveals clear awareness of German advancements, with memos referencing engine performance metrics and configurations rooted in earlier American designs. In 1936, the Spanish Civil War became a testing ground, a proxy conflict where Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy experimented with their latest weapons of war. Military observers at the time noted striking resemblances between Luftwaffe aircraft and earlier American-made models, especially those built by Curtiss-Wright and Pratt & Whitney. From aerodynamic profiles to engine configurations, the echoes were unmistakable. It was the first quiet indication of how deeply American aerospace innovation had influenced the next generation of German warplanes. By the time war officially broke out in 1939, the Luftwaffe wasn't just strong, it was technologically advanced. Many of its frontline aircraft were powered by engines built on licensed, studied, or reverse-engineered American designs. After World War II, Pratt & Whitney and Curtiss-Wright were celebrated as champions of the arsenal of democracy. Pratt & Whitney powered the legendary B-17 Flying Fortress and F-4U Corsairs. Curtiss-Wright built fighters flown by Allied aces across Europe and the Pacific. There were no investigations, no accountability, no mention of pre-war licensing in corporate histories or official biographies. Pratt & Whitney and Curtiss-Wright didn't intend to help Hitler, but their engines did. Their blueprints helped power a Luftwaffe that would bomb cities, crush resistance, and cast shadows over an entire continent. Alcoa, forging the Reich's wings. As the world edged closer to war in the 1930s, aluminum became a strategic resource crucial to building the next generation of warplanes. Through a complex web of subsidiaries, export channels, and licensing agreements, Alcoa's influence quietly extended into the heart of Germany's industrial buildup. Alcoa's factories forged the frames of bombers, the fuselages of fighters, the very skeletons of modern war machines. But here's the question: what happens when the wings of freedom are forged from the same metal that lifted fascism into the sky? When Hitler's warplanes roared over Poland, France, and Britain, they flew on frames made from lightweight, high-strength aluminum. The metal was produced in Germany, but the methods used to refine it bore the unmistakable legacy of Alcoa. As Europe burned and the skies turned to battlefields, German aircraft were lifted by ambition and carried aloft by American innovation that left no fingerprints. Meanwhile, back in the United States, as America ramped up for war, military planners ran into a critical problem. There wasn't enough aluminum. Why? Because Alcoa had actively blocked the rise of domestic competition, particularly a Canadian aluminum producer that might have filled the gap when the U.S. needed it most. During wartime congressional hearings, Alcoa faced accusations of price fixing and deliberately slowing production to protect its monopoly. It was then that Senator Harry Truman issued a chilling warning. If America loses this war, it will be because of Alcoa. Alcoa's metals weren't stamped as weapons, but they became integral to the construction of the very war machines that leveled cities and claimed civilian lives. Germany had stockpiled aluminum reserves, and its factories continued to produce warplanes using refining methods and industrial knowledge acquired years earlier, some of it rooted in American innovation. Alcoa rebranded itself as a national asset, a defender of democracy. But its earlier role in supplying the enemy was never fully investigated. Despite Senate investigations, Alcoa faced no lasting consequences for its actions during the war. Chase National Bank, banking on the Reich. In the early 20th century, Chase National Bank, now known as J.P. Morgan Chase, stood as a towering force in global finance. Throughout the 1930s, the bank actively courted business with German corporations, government ministries, and Nazi-aligned financial entities. Chase executives met with officials from the Reichsbank, offering a suite of services: currency exchange, foreign investment tools, and international transaction networks. It wasn't ideology that brought them to the table. It was profit. One of the most disturbing revelations of the era was Chase Bank's cooperation with Nazi authorities in freezing Jewish bank accounts in occupied France. Even before official orders were issued by the Vichy regime, Chase's Paris branch proactively placed holds on accounts belonging to French Jews, acting in direct coordination with Nazi occupation forces. It was a calculated, preemptive move, designed to stay in favor with the Reich and protect the bank's operations under Nazi control. At the same time, Chase Bank and J.P. Morgan and Company assisted Germany's war effort by enabling Nazi sympathizers, known as Rückwanderer, to purchase German marks using US dollars. These transactions helped funnel resources back into the German economy as it mobilized for war. Even more troubling, the banks reportedly handed over client lists to Nazi officials, who then used the information to recruit spies operating inside the United States. While Jewish families were being arrested and deported from the streets of Paris, their life savings remained locked in Chase vaults, untouched, inaccessible, and under Nazi control. When Nazi Germany invaded Poland in 1939, triggering the start of World War II, most American companies began pulling out. But Chase Bank stayed behind. Investigations conducted by both US and French authorities later revealed that Chase continued operating accounts, processing transfers, and safeguarding German financial interests long after the war had begun. Even as bombs rained down on cities and refugees fled across borders, Chase Bank honored Nazi contracts. Nations were torn apart by war, but in boardrooms, balance sheets still came first. Chase also maintained quiet involvement with one of the most controversial financial institutions of the 20th century, the Bank for International Settlements, BIS, based in Switzerland. Originally established to manage cross-border transactions between central banks, the BIS became, during the war, a financial sanctuary for Nazi Germany. And like many leading banks of the era, Chase maintained connections to the BIS, helping to facilitate currency exchanges and stabilize German-linked monetary flows, even as the Reich swallowed half of Europe. By 1941, as the United States stood on the brink of entering the war, Chase still maintained financial ties to German-linked firms, including companies tied to arms manufacturing, shipping, and raw materials. These weren't incidental or accidental transactions. They were strategic plays designed to secure influence in a post-war Europe, no matter which side claimed victory. After the war, both the U.S. Treasury and French authorities launched investigations into Chase Bank's conduct during the Nazi occupation of France. What they uncovered was damning. Internal records showing Chase's compliance with Nazi financial laws and its willingness to assist the regime in freezing Jewish assets and facilitating currency exchanges. Brown Brothers Harriman and their Wall Street's Nazi connection. In the marble corridors of Wall Street, few names carried more influence than Brown Brothers Harriman. Founded in the 19th century, the firm embodied old wealth, quiet power, and international reach. Its offices were frequented not by crowds, but by kings of commerce, bankers, presidents, and industrialists who sealed history with handshakes, not headlines. But beneath the polished veneer of prestige lay a story few dared to uncover. Brown Brothers Harriman helped finance the very machinery that would fuel Adolf Hitler's rise and ignite the Second World War. Fritz Thyssen, one of Germany's richest industrialists at the time. Thyssen wasn't just a businessman. He was one of Adolf Hitler's earliest and most influential financial supporters. Through his massive industrial empire, Vereinigt Stahlwerk, Thyssen funneled money into the Nazi Party, supplied arms, and helped lay the groundwork for Germany's military buildup. But who looked after his financial interests in the United States? That role belonged to the Union Banking Corporation, UBC, a financial institution with deep ties to the Wall Street firm Brown Brothers Harriman. Based in New York, UBC acted as Thyssen's American financial front. UBC's board included top executives from Brown Brothers Harriman, most notably Prescott Bush, a partner at the firm and the father of future President George H.W. Bush. As Hitler's aggression intensified across Europe, American capital quietly flowed east, fueling the Reich's ambitions without a word of protest from Wall Street. It wasn't until October 1942, almost a full year after the United States entered World War II, that the U.S. government stepped in. Under the Trading with the Enemy Act, they seized the assets of the Union Banking Corporation. UBC was formally accused of operating as a financial front for the Nazis, and its activities were frozen. Inside the seized files were records of transactions with German companies, some directly tied to supplying the Wehrmacht and supporting the SS. While soldiers fought in the trenches and soared through the skies, another war raged quietly, inside bank vaults and corporate boardrooms. Brown Brothers Harriman wasn't just holding funds. They were moving money across borders, hiding it behind legal facades, and multiplying it through strategic mergers. When the U.S. government finally seized assets, no executive from Brown Brothers Harriman faced indictment. No public reckoning followed. No reparations were paid. The firm returned to business as usual, stronger, more respected, its legacy untouched. International Telephone and Telegraph, ITT. An American corporate giant with a reach that stretched from New York to Berlin, from Buenos Aires to Budapest. ITT wasn't just in the business of making devices. It built the backbone of communication, the infrastructure that carried voices, orders, and secrets across continents. And in the 1930s, as fascism spread across Europe like wildfire, that very infrastructure became the nervous system of tyranny. When Hitler rose to power, ITT didn't pull back from Germany. It leaned in. Through subsidiaries like C. Lorenz AG and partnerships with Nazi-controlled telecom firms, ITT helped expand and modernize Germany's telephone exchanges, radio stations, and even its military communication systems. Under ITT's ownership, Lorenz didn't just operate, it innovated. Developed cutting-edge radio and radar systems for the Luftwaffe. Equipped German aircraft with advanced communication gear. Built devices to transmit encrypted military signals. Produced critical components for the V-1 flying bomb, the infamous buzz bomb that terrorized civilians. ITT also held a 25% stake in Focke-Wulf, the German aircraft manufacturer behind the FW-190, one of the most formidable fighter planes in Hitler's arsenal. While U.S. airmen gave their lives above foreign soil, one of America's own corporations was collecting dividends from a factory building the enemy's weapons. Behind ITT's global empire stood powerful guardians. John Foster Dulles, who would later become U.S. Secretary of State, and Allen Dulles, future director of the CIA, played pivotal roles in managing ITT's wartime interests. Working through Swiss law firms and back-channel negotiations, the Dulles brothers ensured that ITT's German assets remained protected, even as the world was at war. When the United States declared war on Germany in 1941, many American companies cut ties. But not ITT. Instead, ITT found ways to keep the money flowing, using neutral subsidiaries, legal loopholes, and clever accounting to maintain its presence in Nazi-controlled Europe. Its executives publicly claimed they had no control over their foreign affiliates. But behind the scenes, the paper trail told a different story: regular communication, steady payments, and calculated efforts to shield assets from Allied seizure. Even during the German occupation of France, ITT's Paris office stayed open and cooperative. Their operations ran so smoothly, so discreetly, that ITT remained active throughout the war, sheltered by diplomacy, driven by profit, and undisturbed by conscience. After the war, ITT executives weren't prosecuted. Instead, ITT was compensated, paid by the US government for damages to its German holdings, including factories that had been bombed by Allied forces. They were reimbursed for aiding the enemy, and rewarded for making it through the war intact. Just quiet rebranding, renewed investment, and global expansion. ITT emerged from the ashes wealthier, more powerful, and more far-reaching than ever before. Operation Paperclip, and Nazis on America's payroll. After Germany's surrender in 1945, the world expected justice. But the United States had already turned its eyes toward a new enemy, the Soviet Union. In the tense early days of the Cold War, national security took priority, and morality took a back seat. That's when Operation Paperclip was born. A covert U.S. program designed to recruit German scientists and engineers, many of whom had been members of the Nazi Party or were tied to war crimes. Over 1,600 Nazi-linked scientists were quietly brought to America. Their records were scrubbed, affiliations hidden, and pasts rewritten to suit the needs of a rising superpower. Among them was Wernher von Braun, the architect of the V-2 rocket, which had rained destruction on London, killing more than 9,000 civilians. And yet, von Braun was not only welcomed, he was celebrated. Granted U.S. citizenship, he rose to become head of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center and played a key role in building the Saturn V rocket, the vehicle that sent Apollo 11 to the moon in 1969. Then there was Hubertus Strughold. A wartime scientist with ties to Luftwaffe medical experiments, Strughold was involved in programs that subjected concentration camp prisoners to freezing temperatures, altitude trauma, and oxygen deprivation, all in the name of scientific advancement. Yet, under Operation Paperclip, he too was brought to America. There, he became a pioneer in space medicine, helping develop the life support systems that would one day keep astronauts alive in orbit. In 1963, NASA even named a medical library after him. It wasn't until decades later, when classified documents began to surface, that the full extent of Strughold's past came to light. By then, the honors had been given, the truth buried. Reinhard Gehlen, a Nazi spy chief turned CIA asset. One of the most controversial figures shielded by the United States after World War II was Reinhard Gehlen, Hitler's top intelligence chief on the Eastern Front. Gehlen had built a vast archive of intelligence on the Soviet Union, and when the war ended, he didn't face trial, he negotiated. Using his knowledge as leverage, he struck a deal with the US military. The result was the creation of the Gehlen Organization, a post-war spy network funded and supported by the CIA, staffed with former SS, Gestapo, and Wehrmacht officers. Many of its operatives were directly connected to war crimes, but because of their perceived value in the Cold War, they were protected from justice. This network would later become the foundation of West Germany's BND, the Federal Intelligence Service, and one of America's closest intelligence allies in Europe. World War II taught us the brutal cost of silence. While millions of innocent lives were lost, some chose profit over principle, influence over integrity.